Hi, good afternoon. It's afternoon by a minute. My name is Daniel Scherzer, and I will be talking about fuzzing the MediaWiki API. I'm an external contractor at Wikitech, and you can also find more information about me on my website, scherzer.dev. So, an overview. First, we're going to define some terms. Then I'm going to talk a bit about how HTTP works. Not going to get into too much technical detail, but just enough to understand how the fuzzing is applied. Then I'm going to talk about what is fuzzing. Then I'll give a brief overview of MediaWiki's REST API before presenting the results and the conclusions I drew from them and taking questions. Any questions before I begin? Some terms. Fuzzing, according to Wikipedia, so take it with a grain of salt, is an automated software testing technique that involves providing invalid, unexpected, or random data as inputs to a computer program. I first came across this in fuzzing PHP code. Any code that you provide to PHP, if it's invalid, should result in an error being thrown rather than the PHP program having a segmentation fault. There have been some tools for fuzzing PHP where you just combine random tests and see, okay, did we get an error output? That's fine. Did we get a segmentation fault? That is a bug. So you're making random changes. You're combining two possible inputs. You're choosing every random number you can think of. You're trying things with, what about the empty string? What about a string that's, 5,000 characters long? And the same technique applies to testing out APIs. You're going to see, okay, the open API spec says this accepts a string. Let's try it with a string that's empty, with a string that's one letter, with a string that's 1,000 letters. How about a string that's not just ASCII? What if we give it some Chinese characters? So that is fuzzing. Finally, REST. Second, REST is the representational state transfer. It's a system for stateless requests. The API doesn't remember who you are. You have to provide authentication each time, for example. Now, REST requests and HTTP requests more generally come in a couple of different flavors. You start with, the request is made by a client to a server. Now, if you've ever connected to MediaWiki and tried to use the upload by URL functionality, in that case, the MediaWiki server is acting as the client when it is retrieving the file from somewhere else. So client is who starts the request, and server is who receives it. A server can be a client in a subsequent request, and a client can be a server in a different request. The terms are specific to a single request. It's a lot of requests. Methods. Get and post are probably the most common. Get is to retrieve things, post is to send them, generally. But there are a couple of others. You can use head, you can use options, you can use put, patch, delete. The key thing is, somewhere in the specification, they have slightly different semantic meanings. And specifically for get versus post and a couple of others, in get requests, the information is encoded in the URL. If you've ever gone to look at page history in MediaWiki, for example, you'll see !action equals history. That is a get request with a parameter. On the other hand, if you wanted to try a post request, you can't just navigate somewhere in your URL bar because parameters to post requests don't go in the URL. They go in the request body. Finally, response codes. There are, in theory, 599 different possible codes. I don't know that they've all been defined, and they're not always applicable to everything. Sorry, 499 response codes. If it starts with a 1, it's an informational response. We got this and something's happening. 200 level responses mean a request is successful. This is what happens when you ask MediaWiki for a page that exists, for example. 300 is what you get when it's a redirect. If you ask MediaWiki for a page that exists but is located somewhere else, you will get a redirect and the target page will be shown, unless you have question mark redirect equals no or whatever the right parameter is. 400, it refers to client errors. The most common is probably 404 not found. This is what MediaWiki will send you if you ask for a page that doesn't exist. It'll show you a nice output of your title and, this doesn't exist. Do you want to search for related terms? Do you want to create it? But make no mistake, you are getting a 404 not found. Finally, 500 level responses refer to server errors. 503, I think, is backend fetch failed. You can have 500, just 00 is a generic something went wrong. Here's my claim. A robust API should never respond with a 500 code. Any valid, from an HTTP perspective, valid request that is sent to MediaWiki's REST API should respond with either success or, hey, you, the client, made an error. There shouldn't be a case where the server complains that something went wrong on the server side. I kind of touched on what fuzzing was when defining the term, but it refers to the random addition or removal or recombination or other addition of random values. Basically, we're going to throw mud at the wall and see if anything sticks. We're going to try every possible combination we can think of using randomness, which means unless you have a specific seed that you're using at the start of every session, your results are not necessarily reproducible. You have to write down, here is the actual request I made, and that's the one that failed, so you can later test that specific request because the fuzzing might not reach it. I'm using a tool that I came across in my reinforcement learning class this semester at Tufts, where I'm getting a master's in computer science. It's open source on GitHub, and I don't know that the conference that it's being presented at has occurred yet, but you can read the paper on archive, the archive but with an X, I think it's pronounced archive. And it was fascinating, and I came across it, and they tested some open API and open source APIs. They were testing locally. One of them that I recognized was WordPress. And I read it, and I figured, what's another tool with a REST API that I know, that happens to be open source, that I know how to run on my computer? MediaWiki. So, MediaWiki has a REST API. It is distinct from the Action API endpoint. Anything to API.php is the Action API. Anything to REST.php is the REST API. It was originally introduced in MediaWiki 1.34, I believe as part of the replacement for the REST base. From what I recall, Parsoid and Visual Editor were using some tools that had a REST API that was not initially part of MediaWiki, and the goal was to replace that external service and migrate them into MediaWiki itself. Compared to the Action API, the options are a lot more limited. You can't delete pages, you can't block, I don't think you can delete pages. I know you can't block users or manipulate user rights or move things. What you can do is fetch revision contents, compare them, and put new contents using the HTTP put request. So there's revision content and comparison, page content and history, and the history of it's replacing REST base. Now, I ran this against core and a couple of extensions. I said, here is the Open API specification for MediaWiki. I then had to make some changes to make it understandable. MediaWiki's Open API spec has custom types, I think, MW-timestamp, a couple others, and the tool that I was using wasn't able to understand those, so I just deleted it. I ran this multiple times. For Core's REST APIs, I was only able to find one 500 level error. If you go to REST and try to compare revision 1 with itself, or presumably any other revision with anything else, you'll get a message, at least I did in my installation, of you need to have wikidif2 installed. Now that's perfectly valid reason for having this error, but the 500 code suggests that something is wrong on the server. MediaWiki's Action API has a fairly simple way for modules to be conditionally enabled or disabled, and I would suggest that that is what should be done for the comparison endpoint of the REST API. If wikidif2 is not available, that endpoint shouldn't be exposed at all, or it should be exposed and always return some 200, here is your body that just says you don't have the software installed. I don't think a 500 error should be reachable like this. Of course, that's just my opinion, and I'm not a core developer, but just wanted to make that suggestion. I also ran the tool against some extensions, including growth experiments. Don't think I've ever used it before. I installed growth experiments and 2 of its dependencies, I think, visual editor and community configurations, something like that. And I just said, here's the OpenAPI spec, let's run through it. And I was told when I reached the add a link suggestion that there's no such task type. Not entirely sure what link recommendations are, what the task system is, how to fix this, what configuration is needed. I would just make the same suggestion. If dependencies are unmet or configuration is missing such that an endpoint would never be available, as appears to be the case here, it shouldn't be exposed in the first place. So, MediaWiki's REST API and those of the extensions tested had very few errors. I was only able to find 2 error cases. It seems that regardless of whatever invalid inputs you give the other endpoints, they work. And for these 2 that failed, it didn't seem to matter what actual inputs you gave it. It was a threshold issue of, oh, this functionality is not enabled or available. So there weren't cases where we had a type error or a database issue or an invalid argument. All of the cases that I would normally expect an API to potentially choke on were handled fine. The tool says any 200 level response or 400 level response, those are all the same. It means we made a request and it was processed. The biggest thing it separates out is what are your 500 level errors. And for the APIs tested, there were very few. The API interface is small, but it stood up well. Any questions? Yes, you're wrong. Let me hand you the microphone.
Do you have any thoughts about the Action API versus the REST API in general? There was some, I think, discussion about getting rid of the Action API entirely. I'm not sure if that's correct, but it is strange that there are 2 different APIs right now.
So first I should say I'm not one of the core developers. I don't have merge access. I don't send code. So this is my understanding. It's not something that I'm working to implement. My understanding from a question I asked either this morning or yesterday was that the REST API itself is one that's deprecated and should be avoided. I would be very nope, Cindy's shaking her head. Let's.
REST-based is going away, but not the REST API.
So the APIs that were separate and are being deprecated, and that is why they were added to MediaWiki, if I'm understanding Cindy correctly. I would be surprised if the entire Action API was going to be deprecated and removed. From what I tested out, it seems a lot easier to use the Action API than the REST API, it's also existed for a lot longer, and it has a lot more functionality. I could understand if the few endpoints that are available in REST were removed from the Action API at some point down the line, but I would be surprised if there was a foundation initiative to implement, user creation and user rights and page deletion and page importing and history merging and protection and all of the other features that exist in the Action API, if there was movement to try and implement those in REST, and then once they are well established and working, to delete them from the Action API. So that's my outside perspective, that it's unlikely that the Action API will be removed, but I'm not a core developer, so I wouldn't be the one that would be removing it if it happened, so I'm not in the loop. Rich.
Thank you, Daniel. It's a very fascinating talk. I think I follow what you're describing, but I think I'm missing a high-level concept. If I understand right, you're describing a process by which you can interrogate an API and identify its failure modes.
Yes.
And you would do this, what would be your reason for doing this if you're not the developer?
So, yes, so one reason would be to give a talk. The other is to find, here is where there are issues. If we go back to the comparison, assuming that WikiDiff 2 was installed, I would test it, okay, what happens when the revision ID you give it doesn't exist? If I compare revision 1 and revision 1,000,000, what happens if those are revision IDs from two different content models? So the reason you would do this is to show that rather than when you write out a whole bunch of unit tests and it's only the cases you can think of testing, fuzzing the REST API would let you test cases you couldn't even think of yourself because it's with random inputs. So it's just to get a better sense of how good is your API before you launch a product, for example.
And would one application be if I'm trying to find vulnerabilities and ways the API could be exploited, this would be a way of exploring its vulnerabilities without knowing exactly how it works?
Yes, very much so. My understanding is that 500 errors are generally not cached. So if you find an endpoint like this, you could DOS it. You could spam a whole bunch of requests, and you would bypass any of the caching in Varnish or whatever other tool the wiki is using. Because generally, you don't want to cache 500 errors because you hope that whatever server error caused those will be resolved the next time the request comes in. Any other questions? Anything on the Zoom chat or the YouTube chat or the Signal chat?
I don't see anything, but I have my own comment, which is you should submit these as bugs on Fabricator, unless giving talks is your preferred bug reporting method.
So that is certainly a very good idea. The problem with that is that I don't have a Fabricator account, and I could probably go and make one, but I'm happy to share the wealth. If anyone else wants to, get the karma or the edit countitis equivalent for filing bugs, you're welcome to do so. Just don't everyone file it, because I assume there's some functionality to close duplicate requests.
You can use your Wikipedia account.
Don't have one of those either. But the suggestion was using my Wikipedia account. Jeffrey, do you want the mic or?
Sure, yeah. 我有一个问题. Do you understand?
Yes, but please ask it in English.
Wow, okay. Tengo una pregunta para ti. So you mentioned that for all these, 1x, 2x, 3x, 4x, 5x requests, that ideally we shouldn't be returning any 5x requests because there are server errors and they can be lazy or whatever. Now, what if the server actually does have an error and you're returning like a 4x? Wouldn't that be like gaslighting the user? Like, this is your problem, not mine.
Yes. So, and a good API, I'm saying, shouldn't return any 500 errors, but a good API wouldn't have any of the internal errors that you would need that gaslighting for. I'm saying that in a situation like this, you might want to return a 404 not found. You could just say this endpoint isn't registered. If there was really a bug internally, 500 would be the right response. I just don't think it is the correct response here. If I had made a request and it said 500 error and the message was, invalid argument exception was caught somewhere along the stack, then 500 would be exactly right, and the bug report would be, hey, there was an invalid argument somewhere in the request chain of function calls. But in this case, I don't think a 500 is appropriate.
Okay, so to clarify, we don't support gaslighting users. We're just saying that a lot of times developers get lazy and they don't return 400s instead they would just return 500s, and we're trying to prevent that. But if there's a legitimate issue with the server, then a 5xx is still appropriate.
Yes. If there is a legitimate issue, you should return the corresponding error code, but we should try and reduce the number of those issues. That's my suggestion.
Thank you. Let's be a reminder that gaslighting is not a good thing to do in this society, and this was not an endorsement of that, so thank you for clarifying.
Anyone else? Going once. Going twice. Seeing and hearing no one else. Thank you for your attention.